They get all excited about the thought that they have their own portal for this training engagement.
Today I'm talking with Greg Bennett, the growth coach of Denver and author of Consultative Closing and 4 other books, 5 actually. Greg, thanks for being here. Let's talk about what you've experienced as a user of CoachAccountable for some years and how it's applied to you and your successes as a growth coach franchisee. So to give a little context for this conversation, you know, it was 2 years ago that we went out for a beer and you told me a couple of things that got me very excited. You said point blank, I've closed deals with large clients to do coaching for them simply because, or not just because, of course you give more to, but one of the defining factors of you is like, because I've got this portal here, this CoachAccountable thing, this platform that I use, and it's made a difference in actually closing coaches. And I said, oh my God, that's great. We got to get this on camera and actually riff a while, and this is a conversation worth having, this is a conversation worth sharing. So here we are 2 years later, took a little time, but finally, I got it together and we got the impetus because the growth coach is considering this as a platform that might be useful for all their coaches. So I want to talk with you and unpack a little about that. Would you please tell me, first of all, about the work that you do as a growth coach?
Sure. Growth Coach is a national franchise. I got the Denver franchise 2 years ago. And I've been a sales trainer and coach for about 30 years, actually, as I'm dating myself here. But I travel all over the country and I've given workshops to a wide variety of companies and small, large, Fortune 500. And my desire was really to settle down more and just do more coaching for business owners as a whole, not just sales, you know, not just show up and do 2 days and get everybody excited and then split. And so I wanted to work with an organization from top to bottom, from working on everything within the organization to help them basically grow and improve.
Let's dive into the having of that client portal, you know, CoachAccountable. When you do have those conversations that you're presenting what it is you can do, and you say, and we've got this thing, how does that go?
You know, if you talk about why this portal makes a difference to a coach, I recognized it not so much in my business coaching, but from being a student of taking lessons. In my case, I was taking saxophone lessons. I did it later in life, and then learning how to play the drums. And you'd show up for a weekly lesson, and I was always mad because the person that was teaching me would ask me the question, so what did we work on last time? And did we discuss this? And I think that is a big problem for a lot of coaches, is that you can only coach so many people because you can only retain so much information about them. Yeah. And what did we say last time? And what issue are you dealing with? Are you the one that is struggling with that? And I have to write down these copious notes, and then I've got to figure out, did we talk about this last time? And I think it's really tough to have high-level coaching or training or music, from music to sales coaching, if you can't keep the information straight and develop a program for progression. And so for me, when I had that portal, what has made it most appealing and what surprised me about CoachAccountable, not only how much I'm excited about it, but more importantly, how much clients are excited about it. They get all excited about the thought that they have their own portal for this training engagement, which means this guy is not going to forget information and I can communicate with him in between our sessions. We don't have to wait till he shows up and I say, so what did we work on last time? Yeah. You know, we already know because it's all planned out and he can see it and I can see it and we don't have to speak, right? I can see his progress. He can see his progress. We can see things that are done and not done. Yeah. So when we talk, your conversations at a much deeper level because I already know how things look. So we can talk about that versus having to spend X amount of time unpacking and you telling me your spin on where you think you are, which is all often kind of jaded. You know, you kind of spin it up that it's much better. But if I can see really where you are, there's a lot of visibility. So I think they love it at first blush. Kind of scares them a little bit.
I was about to say, if I may speak to that, there's something in how you must be speaking about it so that they don't relate it to it as just another login I have to have, just another app I have to install. Like,
Yeah.
how do you get them so excited about this accountability, this idea of this is going to have me more on point?
The words I use are it's your own online dashboard. And that just registers with them. And you can get it on your mobile device. Boom. All the things that go with that, 24/7 access, convenience right there. What's very appealing to people right away is it's not frightening. It's like right away, it's very interactive and intuitive. They see really quick that this is not their CRM, which they're often struggling with and they're furious about. So their fear is a little bit that, is this going to be something we have to go into weeks of training?
Yeah.
And we just got out of our CRM and it is all messed up. Yeah. Is this thing going to be a pain? But the minute they see that, oh no, it's your own online dashboard and it's going to basically do 3 things like this, and they'll get it. And it basically allows us to communicate very quickly back and forth, and then it's a quick 5-minute review, and they get it. And so that to me has made it much more approachable and gets people excited. But I think, to me, the overall thing though is that they feel that this coach understands where I'm going and what I'm doing, and that is going to add a lot of value to our relationship. They just immediately, they pick it up. I mean, I've had people literally say, the minute they see that, yeah, I want in. Just the software, just the interface. I'm like, okay.
Tell me about the kind of good that a growth coach does for businesses and business owners.
Yeah, I think to me, growth coach, what makes it most effective is it provides visibility and accountability are the 2 main factors to me. Other coaches are different, but to me, and maybe it comes from my heavy background on sales, working with salespeople, because people in business, they want to do certain things. Salespeople or a business owner, there's a desire to improve their business, improve their sales. And it comes with certain things they're supposed to do. But that is a lot like working out. I'm supposed to go to the gym and I'm supposed to eat this. I'm supposed to do those things.
Easier said than done.
Easier said than done. And a lot of times I don't do them. So they go into a pretty good set of denial, right? So the way I look at a growth coach is, my biggest asset, I think, is we're going to set some goals and a course for where you want this business to go, where you want to be as a business owner, where you want this business to be. We're going to set goals, and we're going to work on the activities and the behaviors that go along with those goals, and we're going to set a course for doing that, and then we're going to make this all very visible as to how you're actually doing and progressing against those.
Like
and
the
then
scoreboard.
Yeah, and then I'm going to hold you accountable. A big part of it is they don't have, and another reason I like to name is CoachAccountable, right? To me, accountability is the thing that is always missing. Yeah. They can't hold themselves accountable, and they can't hold each other accountable. So I'll work with
When you say each other, is that business owners
Yes.
on the team? Or
Yeah, our team.
Okay, right on.
I work with a lot of professional services firms, and nobody really is the sales manager, right? So there'll be 4 partners and 50 consultants in the firm. So the partners all say to each other that, hey, we all have to do some business development here. And they all agree that they're going to do it, but they don't really know how to hold each other accountable to do that because they're partners and they interact with each other. And it's the same in a business. It's like, I need to hold you accountable, but it's tough for me to do that because you have to report to me, and I've got to read through the BS that you're slinging in this so-called report. So a lot of what people record is BS, right? And because, but when you're interacting with something that you're recording every day, or you're typing in your results and it goes into this system, visibility increases dramatically and accountability. And I think that's what people pay me for more than anything. Is just hold us accountable. Yeah, it's great. You don't need to tell us necessarily what to do. It's helpful. Give some input.
Sure.
We know what we should do.
Everyone knows to go to the gym and eat, right?
Yeah, I just need somebody to make me do it or to remind us that we're not, and to hold that up to us on a regular basis.
Tell me, what's it like when you put a new client into your CoachAccountable system for the first week?
There's 2 types. I get one that are more computer savvy, and I just had one last week. He had already built 4 metrics for himself, and he's already set them up. He started doing them. And other people I'm just introducing. This is a tracking matrix. He's already built 4 on his own. Things he wanted to track, and he's already entering because he dove in and he loved it. He wanted to start, setting up everything.
Yeah.
And so that's like 25% of the people. I would say probably 50% of the people get it and start, responding to emails back and forth, and they'll basically go explore whatever I tell them to go explore. Go look and do that. Go do this assignment. Turn it in on time. Look at your activities.
What kind of assignment might they get in the first week?
The first one may be block out your business development times on your calendar for the next 4 months, right?
A simple task.
Simple task. So it's kind of an action item.
Sure.
And I assign it on, say, Monday. Love to have it done by the end of day Wednesday. And so I'll set up that simple action item to get them used to seeing like how the action item works. And then I'll do like a simple metric to set up, how many hours during this week are you going to study the sales training? So maybe we like to see an hour a day. So we want to chart that so they get used to interacting with the system on a regular basis, just a little bit, right?
So you're helping them develop that habit, say, for the sales training from the get-go.
Yeah, and even just looking at CoachAccountable a regular part of what they do, so that they know that on Monday I'm going to be sending them. I'm big on sending a weekly assignment, so there's a Monday. They get used to the cadence and they see where it is and how to interact with it. And that first week, everything's kind of cool, and it can be a little bit overwhelming though, because then you got that 25% that they are just figuring out, I think, a computer in general and how to work it into their stuff. And these are the ones that are so fed up with their CRM,
Yeah.
And so this is something new for them, and
Technophobes.
it sort of, and it doesn't really frighten them, but they're sort of wading in. And I can tell, the beauty of CoachAccountable also from a coach's perspective, I can tell if you're interacting with this thing or not. I can tell. And so now how can you get that in without something like this? I mean, I can look at your file and I can see your activity level, and if you open an audio file I sent you, how I challenge anybody out there to think about how you would possibly do that, besides having to call somebody and say, have you listened to my audio yet?
And
to which
the
they
word
will
for
lie, right? Yeah, oh no, I listened to it. And I'm just like, no, I know you didn't lie. I know it says not access. So that's one huge thing, but it's really big for the manager or the owner of that company, who's like, part of the reason we brought you in, Greg, is because we've done training for our people before. We've done online training. We made it all, but I don't think they're accessing it.
Okay, got it.
So I work with business owners as well as managers and team members, frontline people. So, using the team edition has been awesome because I can allow sales managers to, get that visibility of their team. And this is one of the huge areas that they struggle with, is like, I have these guys hooked up with this online training that they're supposed to take. And they all told me they've taken it. Then they look at it, but they can't see any visibility into whether or not that is real.
Yeah.
So if you can see that you haven't completed an assignment, and then I can give a report to that manager at the end of the week with a happenings report, like, Frank hasn't accessed anything.
Yeah.
Frank has issues, right? So
we can have a conversation with Frank versus waiting till the end of the program.
Exactly.
And
we
wonder
can
what happened.
have an intervention like, Frank, what's up? And usually it's because they get backed up, they forget about it, and that's the beauty. It's like, let's head these problems off before this whole program is ineffective.
And it sounds like you have those opportunities to intervene and sort of really create for them, hey, this actually does matter. This is important to do this work that this outside person is guiding us to do, because it's all going to help us.
Yes.
Rather than let it fall by the wayside and just crumble.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that you don't want things to fall by the wayside, and you're investing a lot in whatever training you're doing, whether it's me, somebody else, anything else you're doing. There's a lot invested in these people, and you can't see enough to make them accountable. You have no It's hard to be all people accountable if you have no visibility.
Yeah, but I'm getting creepy.
I looked around at what other growth coaches were doing, and other coaches in general, because I was studying that. And I realized they didn't have much as far as technology is concerned. What surprised me is the perception of having this portal, and what that perception did to my growth coach practice. and seeing me just as a growth coach. Because I think people, you know, they judge all sorts of things about you. Like, what does your website look like? What experience have you had? What, you know, your reviews or LinkedIn profiles, or there's so much people look at, right? And I think this one, when they see that I've got this really high-end technology, they think, okay, this guy might be a badass. He might be pretty good, because I've never seen that before. And so the perception and the perceived value automatically goes way up. Another thing is being able to get your materials into your hand. How big is that, especially for young people that are coming in and in business? That's like a table stakes. You've got to get me our training. I got to be able to get whatever. I got to be able to see it here.
Online,
And you having that capability, even though it's not an official app,
Sure.
but I've got it set up at CoachAccountable immediately, and I show it to people, and just this little thing that they can see that logo right there. Oh, okay, cool.
You're the real deal.
You've just passed the real deal test. You made it super convenient for me, because I don't really like taking all this training our company's putting us through, but you just made it a hell of a lot easier. I take this thing with me everywhere, so you tell me that while I'm doing whatever, I can go through my training. Yeah, while I'm riding my bike, while I'm doing whatever, I can go through this frickin' training we have to go through. Or whatever it is we're doling out. It's like, I can do this work you're asking me to do and update right here.
Yeah.
Game changer.
Tell me a little bit about how CoachAccountable fits onto the growth coach's model of coaching.
An absolute hand in glove fit. And I knew it the minute I saw, because I knew CoachAccountable going into Growth Coach. So when I saw the model, I mean, by day one of my orientation, I'm talking up, I'm saying, before we even talk further, I've got to tell you about this coaching portal I'm using. And you've got to make it something that these coaches know about, because it is a game changer to the 10th degree. The ability to interact with people between coaching engagements. You know, CoachAccountable allows you to do that in a very high touch, high feel, low maintenance, low work way. The perception is that I'm constantly in touch with you, interacting with you, seeing you, but that's not always the reality. I'm you know, because of the technology, I mean, I can coach up to 40 people at once. It's impossible to be able to do that if I'm doing all the interaction this way and I have to download live. Impossible. I'd never be able to separate it all, document it, and I'd have to do an hour of prep before every call. But here it's all captured, so I can just glance literally as I'm talking to them, and I know what we talked about last 3 times and what we plan to do this time.
Right.
So for me, when I saw the growth coach model, which is to interact with people, say on a quarterly basis and then a monthly basis, there's a lot of time in between that. And if the only touch point is on a quarterly basis, I'm going to see somebody from quarter to quarter. In this day and age, a quarter is like a lifetime to me. A month is like, I need interaction 24/7. I want, you know, I'm making changes of directions all the time, right? So to me, what I saw is that this is going to, if nothing else, fill the gap between those quarterly interactions and the monthly interactions, and give you daily access into and visibility into how your coachee is doing. You're going to be able to see. So you may have to do an intervention there on something. Were we going to wait for a month for that to take effect? The guy started fluttering and having issues and problems, and you're going to wait a quarter till we can talk about that? Or even, you know, wait till I can catch you on the phone? You know, they often have issues that happen, but they forget to call. But if they're interacting and you're doing updates every week on how did this week go, you capture those things that you may not remember 2 weeks later.
Do you do like a weekly worksheet check-in that automatically gets sent to them, something like that?
Yeah, and a check-in, and it can be, it's almost like a kind of a fun overview of what did you take from this week's work, and you know, how on a scale of 1 to 10, how has your level of confidence changed this week? And it's just those. It's almost like reaching in and just take a snapshot of how you are right now.
Yeah, friendly tap on the shoulder.
Yeah.
Tell me what's up.
Tell me what's up. And we don't have to wait for this massive download where like a month later they're saying, okay, what's going on? What's going on? Well, I was somewhat suicidal about 2 weeks, It's like, I know that. I can see it earlier. They reach out. That ability to have that stream back and forth that CoachAccountable has.
Yeah, little comment threads.
Yeah, it's great because you can go back and see what we had discussed and what we had talked about. And so I think all of that just gives the feeling that my coach is much closer. And how that impacts, to me, the value of the growth coach interaction, it's exponentially higher because you move from that, great to have this sort of coaching element in my life, to that guy is my lifeline. So how much is that worth?
Yeah, wow.
How much are people willing to pay for that and should pay for it? Because I can intervene earlier. So how much is that worth? A lot. A lot, and not only are they willing to pay it, they should be willing to pay for it because I can help them through more things more often before things become a mess and the cost of have to undo something.
So what things do your growth coach colleagues who don't have the benefit of CoachAccountable typically struggle with?
Well, they struggle immediately with the flurry of information. Where do I store it? So you're coming up with ways to do it. You can put it into notes or you can put it into Word docs, and so I've seen some people do like a Google Doc so we can both interact that way. But it's always a combination of answers that they're kind of cobbling together. They'll have a CRM and maybe they'll use a Taskmaster type of software or something. So I think the first thing I noticed is they struggle with being able to coordinate a really effective coaching program, I think. Growth coach is good. They give you some suggestions on some things to do, but actually putting it into place, it's still cumbersome. Even if you're going to have like a Word doc with your CRM and another, you still have 3 or 4 systems you're trying to cobble together. So I think that leads to how much volume can I do? How many people can I coach on a regular basis? Which leads, I think, the third thing they struggle with is communicating the value to the person they're selling to. When they say, well, I understand how your coaching model works, but how are you different? They struggle with differentiation because it comes back to them. And if they haven't had a lot of experience of coaching, you can point to the growth coach programs, which are good, which are fine, which are solid. But people can still say, well, I can find a lot of materials all over the place.
The information.
That's information. Yeah. How are you going to make me different? So differentiation, I think, is a challenge for anybody in business in this day and age, differentiation, because of the growth of competitors everywhere. And I think that's a huge one. So that's where I see a lot of folks struggle.
How do you use CoachAccountable as a sales tool? Like if you're in the conversation or you're trying to sell your services as a coach, how do you plug CoachAccountable into that thing to actually have this as a chip that really lands and resonates?
Yeah. To me, I pepper it in at various parts. And because it goes with my conversation about what makes me unique is I drive visibility and accountability, and I really focus on activity. And the reason I lead with that is because I know that that's what they're looking for to try to get an ROI. The minute I say that, I know I can see their head turning like, well, how do you do that? Because I believe in the same thing. And I'll say, that's why I've got the coolest technology on the planet to make me do it. I'm so glad you asked. That's why I have this. And just that alone, it's like, so if you have that, and I bring you on and just bring that with you, and I can use it for all of our stuff too, sure. Yeah. I mean, that's part of the thing. Now, the bonus is I'm giving you this unbelievably powerful stuff that goes with my training and coaching and all the tools that we have as growth coach, but we're making it super visible. And to me, sales is not only I have to sell the one I'm with, that person has to turn around and sell somebody. So it's tough to sell coaching if you're like, well, yeah, we got these guys. I think I'd like to bring them in. Well, what makes them different? Really not sure, and they can't explain it.
So the person you talk to has their own problem to solve of how
do I sell that? I got to sell this because my boss is saying, why the hell do we need a coach? What makes them unique?
Sure.
Well, they're really good. Well, how? How do you do that?
I had a good feeling when I talked to them.
And all they got to do is pull up and say, well, one of the things they're doing is they're going to give us this. It's like, I just like that.
Tell you what, have you ever had that be part of your sort of maybe quarterly wrap where you bring up the records here are the metrics, here are the things that have been done, here's how the needles have moved. Has that kind of become sort of your, your post-sales, shall we say?
Yeah.
What's that like?
Post-mortem, so to speak. It has been. I need to do more of that, frankly. Because, and I've told you this before, I still think I'm only using like 50% of the capability of CoachAccountable. I know I am, because every time I get on a webinar, I'm like, when did he come up with this? Because the thing I love about CoachAccountable is you're always coming up with something like a new twist, a new angle, and a new way of going about it. So the happenings report, I think, is really, the reason I love it is I don't have to think about it. It just fires off every Friday. And they love it because they can march right down to that thing and say, why aren't you
Frank,
answering anything? Frank, this is the third week in a row. All you got to do is open up. Are you struggling? What's the deal? And, one of the things I notice in this society we have of binge watching and binge doing, that people try to binge training, and they'll like back it up, and you're supposed to be listening to this thing every single week and executing. You can't really do that effectively with training, in my mind, because you got to try it.
For a test.
Yeah, you can't. You can't wait to the end of the month and say, okay, I'll listen to all the segments and I'll go look at the templates and all. That doesn't work that way. So this really heads it off. And one of the things I really like about CoachAccountable, combined with a training program, let's say a 2-day workshop, is 2-day workshops sometimes are like giving people a sugar pill. It's like, drop it in, they're all,
great.
Yes, Jojo the happy circus pet or whatever, they're super excited, and then the come down though is really bad after. Like, they're so motivated, and then after the trainer leaves, it's like, we're back to where we were, right? So I really like to do like a 30, 60, 90-day follow-up, and CoachAccountable is beautiful for that, because you just assign weekly follow-up to what we just discovered, and it can be like a little course. And it's like, we're going to focus on this week, and you need to unpack that, and you need to write a worksheet, and you can watch a video and answer these questions. That is massive, because that owner now feels like, okay, we just didn't do the sugar pill. I could see that these guys are getting it. It's making that transfer from this guy owned it to now my people own it, and they're using it.
So you're able to basically give them a structure where it lasts. It's not just 2 days and then a faded memory quickly, but the sustained hits of re-upping and reapplying and actually getting it into their bones.
Yes, and when you read the reports people are doing, when I read the reports that people do at the end of the week after going through a training, I can tell if they really got it or they didn't, if they're applying it or they don't. And I would never know that without having to have how would I have a conversation of, I'm training 50 people in an organization, I'm going to call all of them? How do I know that? And how does that owner know that? How do you possibly know if John got it? You won't. And usually they don't. They don't know.
What are some of the pitfalls that you would want your growth coach colleagues to know in applying CoachAccountable?
Some of the pitfalls with CoachAccountable, I think, where you could get yourself into trouble, you get way too excited about how powerful these tools are. When I first started doing it, I overdid it. When I first started working with people, I gave them like 5 tasks to do in a week and 3 action items. And I didn't even realize until I started talking to you, it was like, these things all have reminders on them. So people were getting like, they'd get a reminder and then they'd get another one. And next thing you know, they got 15 reminders, and they're barely learning how to hold themselves accountable to go do some action items. So the lesson I learned is, though it's tempting to roll everything out for them, just giving them 1 task a week and make sure they're doing it, and they build that cadence, and maybe shut off the reminders, dial them back a little bit. Maybe 1 reminder, not 8. Because it gets to be like, Greg, I love this system, but I've got like 15 emails here, and it's like, I get it. I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So, I think that's one thing that I've learned to ease up of, don't get too excited about dumping everything on them. Yeah, it's like a personal trainer working with somebody that is a couch potato and that just decided to maybe go to the gym, and the first day, he's got a whistle and he's got a program and he's screaming and he's like, grading every single lift. It'd be like, wait, whoa. I didn't know about that. So
just trying to do some
you got to just like ratchet it back a little bit.
Yeah, ease people in so that they don't get overwhelmed.
I have also found that some people don't interact with it that much outside of just doing a couple of assignments. But they've told me, like, just that alone, I've thought about, and I know I'm supposed to do it, but they don't do a lot on it, right? They don't interact back and forth. And then again, some people are like writing their own, action items and metrics, and I'm like, wow, that's pretty amazing. I had a guy that wrote, like, in his first week, he wrote his own 4 or 5 different metrics that he was doing, and he was tracking them every day. And then he was doing action items, and I'd see action items he'd set for himself.
Yeah.
And they were nothing to do with our interaction. So think about that as an added advantage. Why I would pick CoachAccountable and Growth Coach over somebody else is like, well, you gave me a tool that we're going to use everywhere else. Is that okay? I don't care. Now the beauty is, another bonus of having CoachAccountable with Growth Coach is when Greg leaves, CoachAccountable leaves if I'm using it as my interacting tool. I mean, they could always reach out to you and do it.
Tool, sure.
But I'm the one that has, like, all of the tools built in and all of our materials in there. And I have found when I unplug from it, people kind of freak out a bit. And some will pick it up and do it.
Yeah.
But the real driver of the interactivity is me as the coach, right?
Yeah.
And using the system. But they love, once they get in, it's definitely one that they're like, well, yeah, we're going to keep this around because we love using it.
Well, how do you see CoachAccountable actually adding to the value that any coach can provide?
Where it can add just pure value is in volume. Just the volume that you can do. I'm talking about coaching 50 people at once in a week. And some people can say, well, yeah, I've done that. Yeah, talking to maybe 50 people in a room at once. But I'm talking about individual interactions that I may not be on the phone, but it doesn't have to be on the phone. That's the whole point, is that you can dramatically increase the amount of people that you can coach and interact with. The programs and the ability to deliver, let's say, a 6-month program that I can build in CoachAccountable and deliver to people.
Of course.
Think about the volume that you could increase by having a 1-week program, a 2-week program, a 6-month program, that all you do is you engage with somebody, you plug it in, you set the dates, and it fires off and goes. Now, if you're a personal coach and you had to do that by hand, I mean, so how much volume can I do? Can I coach 20 people through a 6-week program and they all start at different days? You tell me. I think that's an impossibility. Okay. And I've done it with a CoachAccountable that I can start you on a Tuesday. Oh, and you need to take the next week off. I can program all of that. Yeah. Almost impossible to do if you're going to do custom programs. So the amount of volume that you would be able to do and to do standalone programs, I think, really dramatically improves the value of your coaching organization, just the pure number of people that you can put through.
I think is fun about that is when you have a course that you design, you meticulously craft one time, get it all right, and then you set it in motion for people. And that might at the surface look like a, very kind of hands-off. Where's the actual coaching happening? It's just doing a program. But I always tell coaches and encourage them, and tell me if you do this, benevolent stalker time. You get notifications of, hey, what are they doing? When a worksheet is marked complete, it comes right in your email, and you can just hit reply and say, hey, great work. I noticed you really applied this, and if you're struggling about that, book a call with me, da-da-da. And you can just pop in every now and then and look at how things are unfolding with their metrics.
Yes.
And you can be kind of a little stalker, but it's benevolent. And it allows you to put on that very human, personal touch onto those 50 people who are going through that program.
I did a program a couple of weeks back for an organization that had 20 salespeople. And we were starting a course. It was like a 4-week course. So I pre-built the course and it had all sorts of interactions. But on Friday, every Friday they would do what have we learned this week and how has it impacted your life? And I just know that I could check on Fridays and just kind of thumb through, because you can go from one to the next. You made it super convenient to go just to that part for all my students, right?
Previous next.
And I could quickly read that one piece and then I shoot them an email. It's like, oh, awesome point about that. I'm glad you got that out of that. And I know people are like, how? Does he have other people, or how is he? And I think they really like that. Or when you do interact with them live, you can go look at all the work they've done, even before you have the conversation. That's not easy to do. It's like somebody's taking a course, I interact with them third weekend and say, okay, let's talk about week 1. It looks like you were doing this, this, and this. I'm telling them what I'm seeing versus asking. That dynamic is different. And they're trying to think no, I think that was pretty good. I don't remember a lot of it, but we can just go look and say.
You're grounded in facts rather than
grounded
vague recollection.
in facts of the moment as it's happening, not an interpretation later on, which is usually pretty fuzzy.
Yeah, and often rounded up for the sake of looking
always
good.
Rounded up. Oh no, that was good. Yeah, no, I think overall it's been, you get a lot more reality when you check in and take the temperature from time to time. Even on those courses I've had courses that I did a 1-year course that was like, I think I had, I don't know how many files in there. It was massive that I built, but it was so cool because I could also just stop it and let's just stop for a while because the guy was, I'm overwhelmed.
Pause.
I got this huge part. We can pause it.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, I know I'm throwing these things out there to folks that that's not an easy thing to do because you'd have to have a whole nother course building program.
Yeah.
It's all within the CoachAccountable. I can turn off and on a course. And it may seem like anybody can do that. And that's not easy. And to start it quickly, and I don't need to remember when he's starting again because it started next Monday. So those are the things of the mass amounts of details that you don't think about until you really start high-level coaching.
I remember you telling me about the structure that you had where people would get their sort of like, almost like a podcast riff from you at the top of the week. It would be something like a ritual that they could count on, would be delivered in their email, click, listen, and then do the exercises, do a couple action items, and that would set them up for this sort of cadence and habit of learning.
I think a lot of it was the cadence of learning. And I was with somebody the other day and I was talking to her and I'm like, so you haven't accessed the file from this week? I mean, that's just a weird thing that I would know that, versus saying.
How do you make that not creepy?
Well, no, I don't even disguise the fact that it's creepy. It's totally creepy. And I have fun about it. It was just like, I can see everything, so FYI. So just do the work. You might as well just do the work.
Right.
But that's what you signed up for,
Well, there's something magical about, when you're playing your own game, sink or swim. If you sink, well, I wasn't that into it anyway. It was a good idea. When there's a real human being on the other side that actually cares that you do it, that actually knows when you've done it and can cheer you on, or knows when you've done it and can call you out on it.
Yeah, I have a saying that like my desire to help you is bigger than your hate of me coaching you. I'm willing to put up with that.
Yeah.
I know that sometimes you're not going to like me and you're not going to like to see that thing. I'm perfectly willing to play that role. Because I know we both know the bottom line that we end up being bigger. I want you to on occasion push back on some of the things. I want to. That's a healthy sign.
Yeah.
That, man, it's overwhelming. It's like, okay, this is how we're stretching and learning, and I'm going to call you out when, it's the third day in a row when you haven't entered any calls.
I've heard it said that a coach's job is to make you do the things you don't want to do so that you can become the person you want to become.
Yes.
It's all ultimately in service of them.
I was going to bring up something that I've noticed about coaching from my time taking music lessons and stuff. I think there is this idea that a lot of coaches don't ever want you to get better. I don't really want you to learn how to play the saxophone because then you stop coming. Instead of having a real defined goal of where we're going to get to and a path to get there, and then we both discuss. The use of whiteboards inside CoachAccountable, I've really gotten into those for goal tracking. So you can keep the goal up on a whiteboard of where we say we're going to go.
Yeah.
And I want to get there. So I'm going to be a hard ass until we get there because I want to get there.
Yeah.
Because then either I stop and you're there and that's good and I've done my job, or then I start going someplace else. But if I don't really want you to get there, that's what, unfortunately, and it's sick, but a lot of coaches are kind of like that, is that I always want you dependent on me. And so the coaching tends to be kind of average that way. I don't know, I think it just reflects in average coaching.
What you're talking about is you're making a concrete game, and the scoreboard is crystal clear to both parties, and it ain't just on a week-to-week basis. It's the long arc, so you can see, are we getting closer or am I not?
Yeah.
And that actually makes coaches accountable to that, because if they're not delivering, that's going to be evident to the clients more than it would be if it's just well, how do you feel this week? What do you want to talk about? How do you feel this week? What do you want to talk about?
And it also impacts how much I can charge. Because how much would it be, if somebody's learning to play an instrument and say, what would that look like for you to be at this point? And how much would that be worth to get there? That's different than you pay me $150 a week to come in and pretend like we're moving someplace, right?
Yeah.
I want to say, well, would it be
Results-based.
would it be worth $5,000 to do that? So you could play in a band, and it may be for some people to say, yeah. And so if I know that that's the outcome, I'm invested with you. One of the things that I found with my growth coach offerings that others have, I tend to go for much longer engagements and ask for higher fees. And I think a lot of it has to do with the perceived value of what CoachAccountable adds to it, but it's pretty defined on where we're going. So the ROI, okay, so maybe you're going to invest $30,000 with me versus somebody else at $4,000, or some people invest $80,000 with me, but it's pretty clear where we're going. And we're going to know when we're getting there. And that ROI, because they see that's where we're going, then I have to have visibility, then I have to have an accountability. If I'm paying you that much dough, yeah. Now, it'd be a lot for me to ask you that, and all of that is fuzzy. Because then I'm just paying to kind of come in and learn some things.
It's like the accountability cuts both ways. To what you said, you're helping your clients to actually be accountable and do the work and apply it and actually, do what they'll need to do in order to get the results you promise. But at the same time, you're accountable to deliver because it's crystal clear to everyone that it's getting done or that it's not.
That point about how does this make the coach more accountable? I think absolutely. This is a very clear course of action. This is what we're supposed to be doing. And they also see that it's pretty clear what we did last week because the notes are right there. You have no excuse to not arrive in this meeting prepared.
Yeah.
You have no excuse to get away with that, and you shouldn't if you're a real coach, right?
Right.
So, no, I think that accountability definitely cuts both ways.
Thank you so much for coming and talking to you. It's been so good to riff. I'm excited for what this can offer to the growth coaches, your colleagues. Congratulations on your success in developing up in the program and with the quickest start on the record. And here's to the game.
All right.
Thanks for being here.
Right on.